I can easily see the whole thing happening again without any difficulty at all. I just think that if it happened again, exactly the same process will happen. People will swallow it. Governments get better all the time at selling rubbish to the population. The rubbish, for instance, about the Ukraine war, which everybody now accepts is just as idiotic as the rubbish about the Iraq war in 2003. I would be completely unsurprised if the whole thing wasn't repeated in a slightly different form.
Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. 5 years ago this week, in March 2020, Britain shut down its society. A hastily invented policy called lockdowns came into force, and suddenly schools, businesses, pretty much the whole of society was shut down. It was, as many of you will recall vividly, one of the most surreal and eerie periods, certainly in my whole life. Very few people at the time were questioning it. The BBC was blaring out supportive messages for the government. Huge amounts of scorn and accusations of irresponsibility were poured on anyone who dared to question the policies. At UnHerd, we began on the very first day of lockdown this channel, which at the time was called Lockdown TV, and on it we brought together experts, commentators, thinkers from all sides, and did our best to interrogate the policy in something more reasoned than what we were seeing elsewhere. I remain very proud of the work we did during that period, and in the years since. We don't normally look back on this channel. There are plenty of things to be thinking about and worrying about at the moment, but it does feel worth pausing and reflecting just for a moment at this momentous 5-year anniversary and just wondering, perhaps, whether some of the turmoil we see today in fact traces back to bad decisions made during that time. What did it teach us? Crucially, should we forgive the people that got it so wrong? Well, one of the very first people to speak out against those lockdowns, here in the UK at least, was also one of the very first guests on this channel. My first ever encounter with Peter Hitchens got a little bit tense. I think he thought I was another BBC-style pro-lockdown campaigner, but 5 years on from our very first conversation, he joins me once again to go down memory lane for a moment. Welcome back to UnHerd, Peter.
As always, a joy.
So I'm going to start, if that's okay, just by playing a little clip from that conversation. You were, I think, in exactly the same room, so it's a very pleasing continuity we have over that 5-year period.
Yes, I think the ostrich egg, which was in the background at the time, has since been broken.
Right, that's eagle-eyed observers
students of detail will find changes.
You've also grown a beard. Let's have a listen to what you were saying. And just before we listen, let's just remember the atmosphere in those days. This was in the very last day of March 2020. I mean, we are in the first week almost of lockdowns here. The atmosphere is most extraordinary and no one knows what to make of it. And there is almost unanimity in the media in favour of it. Let's hear what you had to say.
If you see a mistake being made, if you think something seriously wrong is going on, it's your job to say so. Even if it means that you're pelted with slime, and even if it means you take a risk that you're being proved wrong. I thought, and I still think, there should be a national debate about this. I think Parliament should be recalled. I think the experts should be reinterrogated. I think other experts who were not consulted, like Professor Sucharit Bhakti of Mainz, should be consulted. I think Professor John Ioannidis of Stanford University should be consulted, particularly about the ridiculous claims made about mortality rates. I think we should pause and wonder what it is that we have done. Okay. And I think that there should be a serious debate about it in which both sides are heard and in which people who think that this is a mistake are not treated as pariahs, are not told that they don't care about the deaths of the old, because it's a lie. I am old, for goodness sake. Of course I care about the deaths of the old anyway. No, but lots of people do. I get it all the time.
Will you be clapping the NHS tonight?
No. I don't believe in compulsory applause. I had enough compulsory joy and enthusiasm at boarding school when I was a child to last me a lifetime, and I had even more of it when I was in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union for a lot of my journalistic life.
There you have it, Peter. There was quite a lot more of that interview that we could possibly enjoy looking back on it. Looking back on that, what do you think? What do you feel?
Oh, gloom, really, because I can easily see the whole thing happening again without any difficulty at all. And it was a rare moment that anybody actually asked my opinion on it. My own newspaper was fantastic. They let me say what I wanted, and I did. But in general, most of broadcasting completely closed to me. and social media was just a festival of abuse. You would get very, very few people responding to you favourably, and an awful lot of people accusing you of being some kind of malicious killer if you so much as breathed a word that this might be excessive or disproportionate. And I just think that if it happened again tomorrow, which it may well do in another form, it won't be exactly the same. Exactly the same process will happen. People will swallow it and they will buy it. Governments get better all the time at selling rubbish to the population. The rubbish, for instance, about the Ukraine war, which everybody now accepts is just as idiotic as the rubbish about the Iraq war in 2003. But the propaganda is so much more sophisticated that people don't question it. So I imagine it will happen again. Possibly not in my lifetime, as I'm getting so old now, but I would be completely unsurprised if the whole thing wasn't repeated in a slightly different form.
Well, we may get onto Ukraine if we have time at the end, but
yeah, sure.
To stick on that kind of lockdown question, you and I have both kind of litigated it ad nauseam almost over the years. It feels a little bit, and I think maybe for both of us, that we'd rather never talk about it again. I certainly feel like there were people who were disappointed that I stopped going on about it. It felt like I should have been more keen to prosecute every last argument, and they reached the point where you sort of get exhausted by it. Do you feel that they've defeated the skeptics almost through that process of exhaustion?
I think skeptics almost always lose because most people want to believe. They want to believe what authority tells them, because if authority is misleading them, then the whole universe is at fault, isn't it? And it's like questioning the verdicts in trials. The moment you start doing that, people will recoil quite reasonably, because if these things can go wrong, then where is justice? Where is just government? Where is competent government? If a government can do something as Olympically stupid as our government did 5 years ago, then how can we ever trust government again? Which is, I have to say, rather a good question. People don't want to wander into that particular desert where you look all around you and you see almost nothing except frightening monsters and ruins. It's not an appealing place to be, and I don't blame people for recoiling from it. Nonetheless, I wish they would be more skeptical of what authority tells them. And one of the things which disappointed me was I had a vestigial belief, sort of Orwellian sentimentality, that the English people were uniquely unwilling to be bamboozled by their governments, but that turned out to be completely unfounded.
That was almost the most frightening part of it, wasn't it? That it wasn't just incompetent people at the top. The polls all consistently showed that people were very much in favour of it. When frightened, people want to sort of be locked down in some way.
And indeed, people like power to be exercised strongly, and you distill power out of fear. And this was an absolutely perfect example of that distillation going on, and people were comforted by it. And so, I'm quite used to being unpopular with lots of people. That doesn't trouble me, but it was quite strong. The disapproval which you can see on people's faces if you carried on behaving like a normal human being, and also the complete collapse of the sense of humour, which is, as I think James Hilton pointed out in that great book, Goodbye, Mr. Chips, is very much an aspect of the sense of proportion. So, for instance, once I got myself up on my bicycle in a Cold War surplus Polish gas mask and rode through Hyde Park wearing this ridiculous object to take the mickey out of the whole thing, thinking that people would laugh or at least look. Like, I think it was André Breton walked through the Luxembourg Gardens with a lobster on a lead. There was that kind of demonstration. I pedalled through Hyde Park. I have to stress on lawful cycle paths. People just treated the whole thing as entirely normal. Oh, look, there's a chap wearing a gas mask. Well, since almost everybody was wearing some kind of face covering, it wasn't particularly shocking to them, and they didn't find it funny. Mockery was useless from the start against it. You couldn't mock it, and that's a really worrying thing. That's another Orwellian point. He said the reason why some countries have the goose step and their armies march past doing this ridiculous prancing walk is precisely because in a normal country people would laugh at it, but in the kind of countries where they have the goose step, people are scared to laugh at it, or just don't think it's normal.
There have been efforts to try and learn lessons from it. There have been various public inquiries and the rest. The scope has almost been designed to exclude the most awkward and embarrassing questions. And therefore, I guess you would share my sense that there hasn't been justice. The huge numbers of people who were kind of enthusiastically bringing in policies that ended up being disastrous are in many cases still in positions of power. Many of them are friends, people I know and still like, and I want to get your sense of how you've navigated that, where you think there are good people who on other topics, on other issues, have useful things to say. Can you forget that they got something so crucial so wrong?
No, I can't, and it has caused some breaches in my life with people who I previously liked more than I like them now, because I simply can't, remembering that they behaved in that way, feel entirely as comfortable with them as I did before. It's terrible. I'd much rather it hadn't happened. But there it is.
But you must have very few friends then, Peter, because it was 90+% of...
But believe you me, if you start out life as a revolutionary socialist and then you abandon it in your 20s, you end up with not many friends. Everybody who previously knew not just stops liking you, but actively loathes you. That's the thing I have to cope with anyway. It may be one of the reasons why I'm so good at dissent. I don't have to worry about losing lots of friends. I've lost them already. But we're talking about people who were still around. Our Prime Minister wanted it all to be even worse. Sir Keir Starmer was prominent among those, saying, let's lock down harder and faster and longer. If he had been in charge at the time, for all I know, we would still be under these ridiculous restrictions because he was so keen on them. So he's one who hasn't in any way suffered from being totally, utterly, ludicrously wrong.
And, of course, the Conservatives, they brought it in. And they have actually suffered, at least at the ballot box. But then you've got to look across the Atlantic, and President Trump has just returned triumphant, re-elected. But let's not forget, he also brought in lockdown.
Yeah, he's succumbed to the mask-wearing frenzy and all the rest of it. Yeah, they did. But I don't think Conservatives suffered because of their COVID performance. They may have suffered indirectly because of it, because they spent all that money they didn't have on all the ridiculous schemes which were necessary to keep the country from turning turtle during the crisis, and therefore created the inflation and the cost of living crisis which everybody now must endure and are almost semi-consciously angry about. But they weren't punished at the polls because they shut the country down. I wish they had been.
So you don't think then, because my sense is this might sound a bit woo-woo or airy-fairy, but my sense is that something quite fundamental was broken during that period, and that a lot of people's skepticism turned into cynicism when they saw the kind of how widespread those policies and failures were. And I feel like a whole chunk of society is now alienated in a way that they weren't before 2020. And a lot of the political turmoil that we see is sort of coming out of that energy. So I do feel like there were real lasting consequences in that respect.
Yes, but they're alienated for the wrong reasons. They're alienated because somebody in Downing Street ate a sandwich or drank a glass of warm white wine during the shutdown when they weren't supposed to. They aren't alienated because of the stupid regulations which made it illegal or whatever it was to have the glass of warm white wine in the sandwich. That doesn't bother them at all. It's that people in office ignored their own stupid rules. It's not that the rules were stupid. It's the wrong sort of discontent. That's why I'm sure it will all happen again, because people were not angry about the things which were important, but did become angry about the things which weren't important. Now, Neil Ferguson got into more trouble for his complicated love life than he ever did for his bizarre predictions.
So you don't think that there's some kind of Freudian transference going on, where there's a general sense that something bad and stupid happened? The anti-incumbent wave manifested, but yes, on the surface for the wrong reasons, but at some visceral level, the electorates knew that the people leading them were stupid, and that's why they all got thrown out.
But then they responded by putting people who were even more stupid in office. So it wasn't the stupidity they objected to, that's the point. If only they objected to the stupidity, there might have been some learning process. But here we have two converging problems. The difficulties of universal suffrage democracy anyway, which are considerable, combined with a rapidly declining level of education and independent thought. And in those conditions, countries are likely to go down the plug hole. And we all know the great example of a sanely run country during this was Sweden. But as I understand it, the reason why that happened was because the Swedish constitution prevented the politicians from getting their way. If they got their way, Sweden would have had exactly the same mad restrictions as everybody else.
That's right, and that's actually, it's a tricky lesson to learn for people who might also be anti-technocrat, that actually the reason Sweden would differed is because the technocrats were all powerful.
Well, in a matter of medical science, it seems quite sensible to give quite a lot of power to people who understand medicine. But I'd call me old-fashioned. But in general, what we don't have in this country anymore is, to the extent we ever had it, and I think we did probably until around about the 60s, is a skeptical, educated elite of people who actually can judge an argument on its merits rather than be swept up by it. And you know, look at our political class. How many of them actually have what would have been regarded as a serious education 50 years ago? Almost none of them. They know almost nothing in terms of history or indeed the history of ideas or of how their societies develop. It's extraordinary when you meet people in the modern political class how little they know. They make me feel like an intellectual, which I have to tell you, I'm absolutely not.
And just the atmosphere of kind of kicking the tires and questioning arguments as an accepted part of the procedure has changed. It's now considered kind of morally, I don't know, bad to question arguments.
If you were, ridiculously, I was called a COVID skeptic, as if I doubted the existence of the disease by one particular person. I was called by another person, the columnist who kills his own readers, and I was actually accused on one occasion. It worked up to quite a pitch on Twitter of actually having had some role in the death of some unfortunate person, which obviously was not true. And this is the similar thing you get if you engage in any critical way in the debate about the Ukraine war. You're immediately accused of being an agent of the Russian government. And there's no dissent is immediately classified as inimical to society and good government, rather than as a good faith objection to a policy which might be questionable.
So if we are trying to be rational, do you think there is any doubt now, 5 years on, that lockdowns were a mistake? And do you now claim that you were right all along? And what do you think the negative effects provably were of that mistake, if you think it was?
You here enter into a sort of Alice in Wonderland world of almost impossible to work out statistics. I retired from the COVID controversy the moment we were finally liberated from the nonsense. I thought, I've had enough of this. I did what I could to combat it. And I've always believed, whether I was right or whether I was wrong, and I do believe that I was right, because what I was basically saying was that the response was disproportionate. Not that we shouldn't respond at all, because that would have been ridiculous, but the response was wholly disproportionate and gravely damaging to society and also to the economy, which does long-term and perilous damage to everything. But the thing that I look back on that I know that I did, because people still come up to me in the street and say it, is I gave some sort of heart to the minority, but substantial minority of people who had the same doubts that I had, but had no voice. And that was the main function that I performed. But when it came to an end and it was all swept away, I was very relieved that I no longer had to have anything to do with it at all. I got sick of being told, "You're not an expert." I said, "Of course I'm not an expert, but Alexander Boris Tfeffel Johnson isn't an expert either, nor is Matt Hancock. You don't attack them for not being experts. They're relying on experts, but they're interpreting what they do." I was relying on people like Professor Ioannidis, who seemed to me to be talking a great deal of sense, and critics in the world of prediction and modelling, critics of Professor Ferguson, who were quite vocal at the time it all began, who seemed to me to be worth listening to. But all I would get was, "You're not an expert. What are your medical qualifications? What are your scientific qualifications?" Well, I don't have any. All I have is a desire to question, which is actually my job as a journalist, a desire to question what authority says and question it rationally. But no, I don't. Once it was over, I was really glad to be free of it, and I don't really want very much, as you can probably tell, to get deeply engaged in it now.
Although perhaps even an educated generalist, I would suggest, could observe that it's not all swept away, that the economic results in terms of people who've left the working population and are still missing on various health grounds, the whole generation of people who missed out school and have suffered mental health difficulties and all sorts of other things, the debt, quite apart from the political turmoil, I mean, we feel the consequences surely still today of those
hugely.
decisions.
And it's catastrophic. And there are so many categories of people. And I mentioned in the initial clip Professor Sichrid Bakhti, who later went off on a tangent about vaccines, which I don't support. But at the time, what he was saying was that it would have a particularly bad effect on the healthy old, whose social lives, which are vital to their continuing health and well-being, would be destroyed. And he was right about that. And I wish that had been attended to more, because an awful lot of people suffered from that. The other thing which one found, and I know of instances of this, people of university age, whose university educations and whole university experience are completely, irrevocably wrecked. A vital part of their growing up, and the damage that has done to people is indescribable. So I'm not very forgiving of it. I don't look at these people and think, oh, well, I was too tough on you at the time. On the contrary, I don't think I was tough enough. Not that it would have made any difference. But the responsibility of the person of power is great, and I don't think they, at any stage, thought seriously about how much damage they might be doing. Not to mention, of course, the collateral damage to the treatment of other things on the health service, which again is still making life very difficult within the health service for an awful lot of people, and will for a long time to come, I think. But no, but it's over, and the intelligent, rational, informed people lost. And if it comes again, they'll lose again.
Are you surprised how forgotten it is? I mean, you walk around today and it really feels like it's never mentioned. Everybody has either collectively amnesia'd it or swept it under the carpet. And it feels a little bit like this huge trauma that we all went through, like a war. And now nobody wants to pretend ever happened. It is quite surreal, because it was not very long ago.
I'm not sure I'd agree with that. I think the evidence of it, particularly if you go around the poorer parts of the country, are very evident. I mean, in the east of Oxford, there's a pub which used to be quite popular and had a big clientele. And I go past it every so often. It was closed during the panic and has not reopened. And each time I go past it, it looks more and more derelict and forlorn. And I think anybody living around there must be conscious of the fact that this was something, a part of their lives, which had been there for many years and has now gone. I think you're constantly reminded of it if you're out in the streets and you see the shops that have closed and the businesses that have gone, and the decay in what you might call the network of daily life that is visible. So no, it may not be that people talk about it all that much, because what can you say? But I think people are constantly reminded of it in experience.
Let's just think about what current issues that are a bit similar might be, because you mentioned Ukraine, and I know you have strong views on that. Do you feel like those same mechanisms that we saw 5 years ago being deployed around COVID, which was a kind of shaming of dissent, a fear, a sense of there being one morally acceptable view and anything else was immoral, do you see those same patterns deployed on other topics? And do you think Ukraine is one of those examples?
I think it is the most prominent one of the time. And the scare story currently being peddled that Vladimir Putin is poised to roll his tanks across Europe, first through Warsaw, then through Vienna, then into Germany, then rolling up via Paris at Dunkirk and pointing his gun barrels across the channel at Blighty. I think this is very much the equivalent of the WMD, and any minute now Saddam Hussein is going to launch missiles against this bilge, which was put out by the government in 2003. But on that occasion, people realized it was bilge, and it failed eventually, and is now looked back on as a mistake, whereas on this occasion, in general, the bilge is accepted as true, and anybody who protests against it is, as I say, immediately accused of some sort of treachery to their nation and of being in the pay of a foreign power.
That has changed, has it not, though, Peter? It feels like on Ukraine, the atmosphere is very different. Everyone is some sort of degree of realist all of a sudden. And whilst 2 years ago, if you'd said that there would need to be a peace negotiation in the end, and we're not going to conquer Russia, that was considered pro-Putin propaganda, whilst everyone seems to accept that now.
Well, yes, but that's a different thing, isn't it? But the discourse about the Ukraine crisis is still very much the same. And so, for instance, there's all this stuff now about how Europe has to spend huge amounts of money it hasn't got on weapons. The fact is that Western Europe, leave out the United States, Western Europe already spends 3 times as much on defense as Russia does. And you can absolutely bet, given the corruption, incompetence, sloth and sloppiness of the Russian arms industry and the terrible Slav army which they've created, you can absolutely guarantee that the Western armed forces will be better than the Russians if they ever came to combat. And yet we're given this story that we need to huddle together and defend ourselves against this gigantic menace. And it's entirely accepted. And if you say, well, actually, no, this isn't true, I got to say, you're
So what is,
Russian
I've got
agent.
to ask, what is the Peter Hitchens proposal for Europe?
I don't have
Ukraine?
one. And my proposal was we should never have started this in the first place. I'm with the great George Kennan, the greatest American diplomat of the 20th century, who warned in 1998 that NATO expansion eastwards would lead to big trouble. And he was dead right. He shortly afterwards died, but he was ignored, and a different foreign policy faction in Washington, D.C., mainly gathered around Paul Wolfowitz and Dick Cheney and people of that kind, pursued the idea that Russia had to be in some way prevented from ever rising again, as if it was going too much. And that's been the policy, and accompanied by NATO expansion, it's led to a wholly predictable disaster. I wouldn't have done that, but since it was done, I warned against it and tried to explain to people what was going on. But most people still don't understand it, and there isn't any willingness or readiness to listen, because any dissent is immediately classified.
But starting from where we are now, we still have to make a decision as to what to do next and how to engage with Russia, how to deal with President Trump's ideas. Where do you stand on that?
Well, it's difficult. It's the great Winston Churchill warning that the wars of democracies would be much worse than the wars of kings, because democracies, to engage in wars, have to persuade their populations to do this terrible, costly, dangerous thing in which people die and the quality of life deteriorates and freedom is squashed. And to do that, they have to make out that the cause for which we fight is a tremendous, perfect, beautiful, shining cause which everybody has to support. And then suddenly the point comes where the war has got to a moment where it's actually not going very well and victory is unlikely, and you have to bring it to an end. And you have to turn to the same people who you've told is absolutely essential that we fight on to the end and say, now we don't. It's very difficult. And it's difficult also for poor old Vladimir Zelensky, by the way, a person I've never, as far as I can recall, disrespected or criticized, who seems to me to have borne himself extremely well in this crisis. But he is in a country in which there are very, very powerful factions which are always going to be unwilling to accept any sort of compromised peace and will immediately denounce it as capitulation. It's already happened to him once. He tried to make peace in his he was a peace candidate. He was the peace president. He tried to make peace in his early years, and he was destroyed on that, both by his predecessor, Petro Poroshenko, and also by the ultra-nationalists in the west of the country, and he wasn't able to do it. So he knows perfectly well if he makes any kind of peace, he will be immediately denounced as a capitulator who's given the country up to the Russians. But I wouldn't have designed it like this. I think it's quite wrong that countries should benefit by regaining territory from illegal invasions of their neighbours. It's absolutely, obviously wrong. But how else is it going to end? Can anybody suggest it? I don't know. But it's quite possible that neither side is going to be willing to sign on the dotted line a compromise. So you have a frozen conflict like the one in the Middle East, where it was never possible to find a leader of the Arabs in the region who was prepared to actually sign a deal, because he would immediately have been, at the very least, driven from the office, and perhaps worse. So it's difficult. When Donald Trump started saying, I can solve this easily, I thought, well, it's all very well to say that, but both the leaders involved have so much at stake that if either of them gives anything significant away, they're done for. So how are they going to be brought to a compromise? I don't know. But so I would not have started from here, and I can claim with some justice to have warned of this long ago.
This is now going to sound like a bit of an absurdly meta question, but it's the one I want to conclude with, if I may, which is, are you, by just coincidence, in the minority view on so many of these big topics? Or do you feel that is your role? Is it the case that your heuristic is that the mob is, or the herd is probably wrong, and therefore you better oppose them? Or do you just reach a different conclusion?
I'm in majority view on things like dental hygiene and the force of gravity, and I love the English countryside, and I'm in favour of the enforcement of law. I'm completely in the mainstream on most major issues, but there are some issues where I cannot be, because I look at what's being said and done, and I disapprove of it, because that's the way I was brought up and that's the way I was educated. My parents did not go through 1939 to 1945, in which they endured quite a lot, so that I could be a compliant, nodding dog, accepting everything I was told. That's not what it was about. And I wasn't brought up that way. And I was also, because I'm so fantastically old, educated in
Not that old.
old-fashioned way to criticize rather than accept what I was told. But it's not. I'm almost everything, and I don't go around naked. I accept the majority view on all kinds of straightforward, normal things. But when it comes to making stupid wars in places where we have no business, I'm against it. And when it comes to shutting down and bankrupting the country unnecessarily over a disease that doesn't merit it, I'm against it. It's not. Why aren't there more people like me is the question you should ask, not what's wrong with me.
Well, we are doing our best to find them here at UnHerd, and
Good luck.
There are some others. I will no doubt be accused of having given you a very soft interview, but
If you want to do it again with a no,
I will
I'll
confess
run in earlier on
that
today about dyslexia, if you want to do that.
I will confess, I for one am happy that you are taking those positions, and I think it's an important service to the conversation. So thank you for that. Peter, pleasure as always. See you hopefully in sooner than 5 years' time.
Let's hope so. Thanks a lot, Freddie.
That was the one and only Peter Hitchens. As I said just then, I'll probably be accused of giving him a bit of a soft ride. And perhaps I did, because I will be honest, I feel like he deserves a bit of a victory lap 5 years on, because a lot of what he was saying at the time was extremely unpopular, and it took a certain bravery to say it. And a lot of those things have been proven instinctively correct. Coming up soon, we will also have a deep dive with Jay Bhattacharya. He is the person about to be confirmed, or may be confirmed already by the time you hear this, as head of the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, which commands a $48 billion budget. So he, having also been a skeptic of lockdowns, having been someone on the outside, something of a pariah 5 years ago, now finds himself in a position of huge authority. We are talking to him. We have an exclusive interview with him walking around his Stanford campus and remembering the dark days of 2020. Watch out for that. Coming soon. In the meantime, this was UnHerd.